Wait until I'm here. We have the most extraordinary sort of person, Kellen Martin, who I never really get to thank, but he sort of makes everything that happens in this room and kind of across the organization work, from technology, media, strength of calm personality. And so when he tells me to come on stage, I do it. And so welcome to everybody tonight. I'm Leslie. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Leslie Vinjamuri. I am the new president and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Before the panel comes out, I have just a very brief thing, two things to say. One is what extraordinary survey results we have tonight. We're going to say a lot more about that, but this really is path-breaking. To have this level of understanding and insight into the Chinese public is not something to be taken for granted. And I felt, as a very new addition to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, I felt incredibly proud as I was rereading through the briefs and the data late last night. I thought this is really the beating heart of the Chicago Council. It is a whole new dimension. It is incredibly important, and how wonderful and how lucky I am and we are to be part of the launch. The second thing is we're on the record, and we are, as you know, nonpartisan. We don't take institutional positions. So anything that individuals say is to be attributed to the individual and not to the institution, although we love the credit for having hosted the data. And then the most important thing is just to introduce to you Matthew DeGallen, the Vice President of Communications at the Carter Center, who was the partner critically in this very important work. And Matthew, please come to the stage. Please welcome Matthew, who's going to say a few words. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. And thank you, Leslie. It's just a thrill to be here today. As Leslie mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Communications at the Carter Center based in Atlanta. And we hope if you find yourself in Atlanta, you will come to pay us a visit. It's a wonderful place to visit and learn about our work, President Carter, his history, etc. So, but it's a real privilege to be here tonight to share the insights we've gleaned from this important research on Chinese public opinion. And I'm going to be very brief tonight, but I did want to thank first our partners here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for making this research possible and for hosting this event tonight. I also want to express our gratitude to the Dr. Scholl Foundation, which very generously supported the research. And finally, I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Yawei Liu, who you'll meet in a minute, and Dr. Yawei and Dr. Nick Zeller, who work with me at the Carter Center and have been instrumental in this work. So for those of you who don't know, the Carter Center was founded by Jimmy and Rosalind Carter after President Carter was, as he liked to say, involuntarily retired from the White House back in 1980 after the election. And today, the Carter Center staff are active in dozens of countries around the world, waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope. And just this week, to give you an example, the Carter Center staff observed the elections in Guyana. And just last month, we helped distribute medicine to 3 million people in Chad to prevent the transmission of river blindness. So tonight, of course, you'll be hearing about our focus on China, where we seek to build understanding between the U.S. and our giant neighbor across the Pacific. The Carter Center's work today continues a legacy that began in 1979 when President Carter made the historic decision to normalize relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. President Carter continued to care deeply about China in his post-presidency. After leaving office, he visited the country 11 times, which is just a remarkable amount of trips to a single country. And he worked really closely with Dr. Liu to build the China program that we have at the Carter Center. So the through line for all of our work at the Carter Center, whether it's in China or Chad or Chicago, is President and Mrs. Carter's vision of a more peaceful and compassionate world. President Carter always urged us not to replicate what others were doing, but to look for the critical gaps where our actions could tip the scales. That's what we try to do. So partnering with the Chicago Council to better understand the views of the Chinese people fills exactly such a gap, and at a really critical time in the history of the U.S. and China's relationship. The panelists will share in just a moment that it is no simple task to conduct a survey of Chinese public opinion. So you'll be getting a rare glimpse into the hopes, fears, and sentiments of Chinese citizens. The data, as you'll hear in just a few moments, is fascinating. But what always intrigues me as a communications person is the story behind the data. Most strikingly, it is a story of the incredible confidence and optimism of the Chinese people. It is also a story of opportunity for U.S.-Chinese cooperation, global trade, and regional security. But perhaps most importantly, thanks to the rigorous methods used by our team and by the Chicago Council, it is a story told by the Chinese people themselves. These findings remind us of what President Carter believed so deeply, that peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. Tonight's conversation is one step in advancing that understanding. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I thank you all for being here, and our program will start in just a moment. Thank you all.
Okay, so here we are. It's great again to be back and to recognize a very valuable partnership on a set of questions about how the Chinese public, the people, think about China's role in the world, China's friendships with other states, Chinese attitudes towards global engagement, towards economic competition. And I don't know if my colleague, Dina Smeltz, who is Vice President of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy and has a very long, distinguished, quite frankly, an extraordinary career in public opinion. I don't know if Dina is also sort of got a crystal lens or ball and knew exactly when to ensure, together with our partners at the Carter Center, when to publish this. But for anybody who sort of isn't, behind closed doors with no access to social media, I think everybody else understands that this has been really a remarkable few days for watching China and its possibly its ambitions, but certainly its presentation of itself to much of the rest of the world, its convening power. Through one vehicle, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which met in Beijing, the military parade, which we've seen, the meetings between the president of China, Modi, the leader of India, Vladimir Putin, Russia's leader, and the list is longer. Not all in each meeting. Modi, I believe, wasn't at the military parade, but it's been an extraordinary and remarkable week. It builds on a long period during which the United States public, I think, has become, and Dina will tell us more, increasingly aware of and concerned about China and global engagements, and a lot of that, as we know, kind of turned during COVID. So to have this data in the public realm is really remarkable. And I think the granularity, the questions that were asked, the things that have been shared are really well worth reading. So as we begin the panel conversation, I really encourage you to kind of dig deep, read the 4 briefs on the website, because there is a huge amount in there. Before I introduce very briefly our three distinguished speakers and contributors to this work, or two to the work and one to the council. I'll just say that one of the things that stood out to me most is the most obvious thing. Perhaps some people might have anticipated it, but maybe not. Sometimes the most obvious things are also some of the most extraordinary things. And it was the 9 in 10 Chinese wishing to have a prominent and active global role, which compares to, I think Dina said, 56% of Americans, the lowest number in the most recent survey that Dina led on with the Chicago Council and her broader team that looked at American attitudes. So that, that is something that I think many of us are partly aware of, at least where Americans might be today, but that the contrast is really remarkable. So to give very brief introductions to three very distinguished people. Dr. Yawei Liu from the Carter Center, who is Director, Vice President, Senior Advisor of the China Focus Project at the Carter Center, is also an adjunct professor at Emory, but has been at the Carter Center for 25 years. Dina Smeltz, my colleague, who, again, rock star in the world of public opinion and at the Chicago Council and far beyond, several decades, more than 20 years, 25 years, and still only 35 years old, running public opinion at the State Department here at the Chicago Council and really putting us on the map with this work. So tremendous work. And her team, Craig Kafora and Carl, are in the audience and have been really important contributors, as well as Lemma. So there's a broader team always to back up something as significant as this work. Takes a village. Paul Heer, a non-resident senior fellow here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. My first time meeting you in person. I feel very fortunate. And you've had a 30-year and very distinguished career in the intelligence agencies in Washington before you came across to Washington, to Chicago, and are the recipient of at least 2 very distinguished awards. So it's great to have you all here. So let's sort of begin straight away. I guess I'll turn to you, since we always start with the visitors, the distinguished visitors and the partner. What stood out to you the most about this poll? It is remarkable. There's a lot in there. It comes, again, at that moment when we've seen China launch its global governance initiative. In this broader context, what surprised you, if anything?
Well, nothing really surprises me, but as you and Matt mentioned, I think the first takeaway of this big survey is how confident the Chinese feel about their future, about their security, about the role that China is going to play, and about supporting Beijing's effort to play a proactive role in global arena. And I think, this is basically say how good they feel. Although we hear China's economy is going nowhere, of course you wonder, and we can discuss, what is the source of that optimism. The second takeaway is U.S., how Chinese people see the U.S., and this very complicated relationship between China and the United States. I wrote my dissertation on Mao's perception of the United States. I think the survey shows somewhat similar mentalities. Mao, from when he got to know the United States for the first time until he died on September the 7th, 1976, he loved the U.S. He wanted to swim in the Mississippi River. He felt this is a great civilization. But he was a spurned, jaded lover, because at every stop of his rising career, he felt the U.S. was a big wall stopping him. And this is what the survey found. Most of the Chinese people feel U.S. is the most dominant player in the world, period. But also the far more majority of the Chinese people feel U.S. is determined to contain the rise of China. Not by the equal number, but a lot of the Chinese feel there are many, many areas where the two countries can work together. So I think fundamentally what the survey shows is the destinies of these two countries are interconnected. It's up to the people to uphold peace, but it's really up to the leaders to find a path forward. The last thing I want to say is you mentioned in the last couple of days, what kind of show China has put forward. And but I think even though the display, the military parade, the meeting in Tianjin, the Shanghai organization, I think down at the bottom of the heart of the Chinese people, there is this under siege mentality. U.S. is hostile. Japan is hostile. South Korea is hostile. Japan is even more hostile. And the heads of 26 countries look at where they're coming from. 2 came from Europe, many from Central Asia, some from Africa. They're all second, third tier countries, if we can say that. So the Chinese feel that not only the U.S. is determined to contain the rise of China, U.S. actually is leading a global coalition to deny China what it so feels, so deserved to have. So these are the 3 takeaways from the survey.
Thank you. And to put a number on it, I think the data suggested that 83% of the Chinese do not believe that the United States is a friend. But you also make a very powerful point. It's not always how it's parlayed in the media in the current environment. From China's perspective, that feeling of being encircled, there's certainly a lot of discussion, if not debate, to be had about that. But it is it's different from what has been coming out of, I think, the sort of headline news in the last few days, which is much more a story about China's ambitions, possibly its assertiveness bordering on aggression. And there is a gap between many scholars of China and I think what tends to dominate in the media. So there's clearly a discussion to be had, hard to know where to land. Dina, you've worked on this considerably with the team and obviously with the Carter Center. You know this data very, very well, and you know the U.S. over decades of experience. So what to you stood out in this?
So one thing is that what you mentioned, Leslie, the confidence in the Chinese people and the willingness to take an active part on the world stage. So looking at the United States, which has played a role as a global leader for a long time, and now we're facing a public that is a little fatigued and tired of that role, and we see the waning support, and then China more recently risen, feeling very confident about their own country, their country's place in the world, how influential it is. Other surveys, a Tsinghua University poll found that while the Chinese public sees China's influence increasing now and in the next 5 years, they see the United States' influence decreasing in the next 5 years, and currently not less influential, but on the path toward less influence. So that it was striking just where we have been and where the public is now, and seeing a dynamism among the Chinese public to take an active role in world affairs. And then the other surprising thing for me is that in Western media, what underpins some of this optimism and ambitiousness is that the Chinese public senses the great advances their country has made economically. In the 1980s, early 1980s, 90% of the public was in poverty. Now, I think about half are in the middle class. That definitely comes through in the data, even though in the Western media, we hear all about China's structural economic problems. Maybe that isn't being forecast or portrayed in Chinese media because, of course, it's a closed environment. But they sense that their economic situation of the country is pretty strong, very strong, large majorities. And they also see their own economic situations as being pretty good. Only 11% say they struggle to make ends meet. And I think about 56% say they have enough to spend a few extras or even buy some luxury goods. That's a very small percentage. But those were surprising to me. In fact, I went back to our polling partner Newark at University of Chicago, I went back and said, are these numbers right? Because from what I read, there's all these economic difficulties, but it's not showing up in the data. And but it does seem how people feel. And again, it's a retrospective look at where they were 10, 15 years ago versus now. So that's especially strong among older Chinese people.
Yeah, and this is interesting. So that you do some generational, you set out different age groups. And so you're seeing a difference.
Yeah, one thing that was surprising there is that conventional wisdom has been that younger Chinese people are more nationalistic, but that doesn't bear out in our data. We actually kind of buck the conventional wisdom. We find that the younger citizens tend to be less nationalistic, more open to even U.S. relations relatively, and it's the older Chinese people who are more so. And again, that might reflect where China was over their lifetime compared to current generations.
Right. Okay. So I want to come back to this after we've gotten you into the conversation about, where you think, how you kind of, as people who are expert on public opinion, how you make sense of that category of data, as it were, in this context. But Paul, what stood out to you? What surprised you?
Well, the primary thing that jumped out at me is the same thing that jumped out for Yawei and Dina. The reflection of the Chinese public's confidence about the national trajectory that they're on, and their determination to increasingly play a decisive role in the world. I think some of the interesting, I'll come back to that in a minute, in terms of what precise kind of role they want to play. But the fact that their perception or their assessment of the balance of power in the world, particularly between China and the United States, is central to that. I think one of the recurring themes through the data and the analysis was this idea that the Chinese views are very much subject to evolution and change depending on developments and trends and their perception of that. And I think both of you have already said this idea that the United States really jumps out as the key variable. I think China's perception in two respects. One, that they see China's position as partly a function of their assessment of whether their leverage is growing relative to that of the United States. And particularly in recent months and years, the idea that the United States is kind of on its back foot now. And I think this has fueled both the perception in China, which is reflected, I think, in these results, that China is kind of on the rise, is kind of a comer. And that gives them an opportunities to exploit, which arguably we saw today in Beijing and yesterday, the perception both internationally and in China that the United States is in somewhat retreat or decline or is dysfunctional, or however you want to get the way they describe the narrative. The second element is that their assessment, which was reflected, I think, in the data of how they want to deal with Washington, the variable there is their assessment of our intentions, which Yawei outlined, their perception that our goal is to contain and keep them separate and weak. And it's interesting. I saw it was really interesting in some of the data that suggested that the support for different approaches to the United States depended on whether the respondent thought that China was in a stronger position relative to the United States. Mm-hmm. The folks who thought that the Chinese were weaker were more inclined toward an engagement strategy, and the folks that thought China was stronger were more inclined toward pursuing a more assertive approach. I hope we come back to that. But those were the key things that jumped out at me, the kind of the U.S. as the variable in their perception and the fact that this continues to change over time.
That last point you drew out was very interesting, and it's a level of subtlety. Again, I really encourage you to go back and read the briefs, and it's one data point that, sometimes when you read the public opinion, I guess, and Dina, we've talked about this, you sort of think, okay, this is telling us something about what the Chinese leadership must be channeling, given that a lot of external communications are relatively well controlled. It tells public opinion data must tell us something about what's being channeled to the people, which doesn't make it less or more important. It's a different way of looking at it. But when you see this kind of result, where people who think, depending on what their view is of China's power, they have a different feeling or a different attitude about what China's strategy of engagement should or shouldn't be, that can't simply be a reflection of what the Chinese government is saying, because that's a level of granularity that really gets at something that's goes beyond any kind of state-led interpretation that is reflected through public opinion.
That was also interesting in the data, Leslie, that a majority of the Chinese think they are economically and militarily on par or stronger than the United States, which in American public opinion, that's not the case, although it's moving, but it's not the case. So that was also really interesting, just given what we hear and our own beliefs.
Absolutely. Go ahead, please.
I think that dovetails too with what I thought were some of the most interesting results to me. The questions on what global leadership role the Chinese think China should play. Because the conventional wisdom in the West, frankly, and this is highly debated, is that China's goal is to replace the United States as the global superpower, the global hegemon. And there was a lot more subtlety in the data here. A plurality, 48% said that China should exercise a shared leadership role, which I think is contrary to that conventional wisdom, that the Chinese are, in fact, interested in. I think shared leadership implies an acceptance of peaceful coexistence with the United States and the West. But the Chinese are curious. They're still skeptical that we're interested in that.
Right.
But then,
and according to the public opinion data, they might have reason to be skeptical. Let me come to you, Yawei, and a couple of things. One is, to build on this point, the data suggests that the Chinese, correct me when I'm wrong, that the Chinese public is interested in engaging through the UN. They see this as very valuable, more so, I believe, and again, correct me when I'm wrong, than the American public do in the current moment. That is certainly reflected through the Global Governance Initiative that was just launched, which talks about sovereignty for sure, but multilateral engagement. This is, coming from the top, and so it seems to be that there's a little bit of a divergence in this current moment between where the Chinese people are, where the leadership is when it comes to that particular form of global engagement. But I want to ask you the question about friends, because it's again, that for many people, whether it should be, whether that was just symbolism and a moment, or whether what we just saw across our TV screens and our newspapers was actually an indication of something that we should really be sitting up tall about, which is the rest of the world, so to speak, getting together and really embracing each other, with Europe and the United States nowhere to be seen. And if you look at your data, it suggests that the Chinese, to go back to this, 83% of the Chinese do not see the United States as a friend. And Dina and I were exchanging a note on this, and you were, glass half full. I was glass half empty on the European Union data. 50% of the Chinese public, in my view, only 50%, see the European Union as a friend. So the broader picture that, if you kind of put it all together without a deeper understanding, which you have in spades, is, wow, where are we, the so-called West? They don't see us as a friend. They do see Russia, India, and other states.
North Korea.
So not
Russia.
India, but I'm wondering
Korea.
whether the polling might have flipped if it were taking place in the last few weeks.
India is an enemy.
But things have changed in the last
it was
week. So
60%
question mark.
not a friend, so now it could have changed, absolutely.
Question mark. So tell us your interpretation. How do you think about the data that's come across on how the Chinese see their friends?
Yeah, if you watch the parade last night, you will see the only two best Chinese friends are Russia and North Korea, because they flank the Chinese leadership. But that's what I think the survey is questionable, at least from the public opinion survey and from the anecdotal and the interaction with ordinary and elite Chinese. Chicago Council obviously is not the only, or the Carter Center, the only two organizations that are doing this survey. So we do have Tsinghua Center for International Strategy and Security. They did one in 2023, one in 2024. China Institute of Alberta University did another survey. There was also the Asia Barometer that did a survey back in 2019. All these surveys plus ours have identified Russia and North Korea as the most reliable countries in the world. In the Tsinghua survey, the most interesting thing is there are 4 categories. One is to work, second to study, third to travel, and the fourth is to emigrate. Russia beats China on all 3, with the exception of study. More Chinese want to send their children to study here, but more of them want to work, travel, and even emigrate. That counters common sense in China. To work in Russia? To travel to Russia? Russia totally discriminates against the Chinese. Russia fear the so-called yellow peril. So I think it's more the security concern driving the Chinese people saying that Russia is most reliable, from when Russia wanted to drop nuclear bombs on China in 1960 to now. Russia kind of like a little brother now, and relying on Chinese buying their stuff to sustain their war effort. I think there is no emotional tie. That's as far as I'm concerned between the Chinese people and the Russian people. So that's a gap between the public survey and sort of the common sense approach of where Chinese are. But we really need to be sensitive to that. North Korea is the same thing. I think most of the Chinese feel North Koreans are the most ungrateful bunch of people under the earth. So many Chinese died. And everyone thinks China has a huge impact on their decision making. China has none, or very little. The fact that he came is a surprise to many.
Why do you think he came? And then we're going to come to Dina.
I think it's the war in Ukraine. It's, China sent volunteers to Korea in the 1950s. Now North Korea did the same in the Russian case. So, kind of like irony of history. And I think symbolism of, this is what the world talks about, is, the access of 3 countries, targeting the West. That symbolism, it is symbolic, but I think that symbolism is going to hurt the long-term eventual interest of China and the Chinese people.
Dina, you want to jump
just
in?
Quickly, I was just going to add, that's so interesting to hear that. But we also have done a lot of surveys in Russia with the Levada Center there. And they also see China as a very strong ally, and North Korea. And a lot of this is because U.S. policy over the last couple of years has pushed countries together into this. Yeah, I think CSIS called it the axis of disruption or something like that. But yeah, so it's super interesting that the publics feel this affinity, even if the governments don't.
I'm really glad you made that point, because it actually was what I was thinking about. We know that we lost Professor Joe Nye recently, who really helped us to think about in a serious way and understand the importance and the significance of soft power in general and America's soft power in particular. And it does lead one to assume, it's very hard to, you have to kind of develop what public opinion, what it leads you to believe. And there's a lot of measured assumptions based on, deep knowledge of the countries that the surveys are taken from. But it does seem that there's something that's not being communicated. It's either, and it could be that America is being read by Chinese citizens as pushing them away. It could be that that's coming from their own government. It could come from a range of places. But either way, it's a problem, right, for the United States, or it's potentially a problem. Would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, because I think that reinforces the point that I was going to make. And when I look at the results and how they rate their friends and non-friends, it seems to me, again, that the United States is one of the key variables in their assessment of which where they want to put them on that spectrum. I noticed that it was the exact same percentage of people that of Chinese who saw the United States as not a friend, 83% that saw Russia as a friend. But that's because they perceive Russia and North Korea and other countries as more aligned with China's strategic interests relative to the collective challenge that they perceive from the United States. And I think when you look through the list of other countries here, both other countries and their neighbors, I think it kind of falls down somewhat nicely. The ones that kind of are closer to friends are the ones that they think there's room where they can score points at the United States' expense, or countries that they perceive as less aligned against China and its interests. Whereas when you look at the ones that are not their friends, Japan, the Philippines, and even Vietnam, I think that appeared on that list. Because recent developments and trends have reinforced the Chinese perception that the United States is using them as partners in their containment strategy against China. But again, this all is very much subject to flux, as you already noted, with the changing role of India in their perception now. They were on the non-friend list when the poll was taken back in April. I think, as Dina said, they probably switched over since then.
It's it's so much in this is interesting. It's also at a moment when we have spent a lot of time trying to understand where Americans are, rightfully so, given who we are and where we're located. But it is incredibly important, I think, for the Council and for other organizations in the United States, especially right now, people who are globally aware, regardless of what your politics are, regardless of where your positions are in foreign policy. It's incredibly important, I think, in this moment to have a strong sense of how the rest of the world is looking at the United States. We've been the most powerful, most influential country over more than 8 decades. And, I just spent 19 years living outside the country. And I think we all travel a huge amount. Everybody in the audience, I'm sure, included and online. We know that people don't share our perceptions of ourselves. And in a world where our influence is, about trade, it's about economic engagement, it's about thing that depends on people, it's incredibly important that we not only do these surveys, and that is, I think, for us, it's sort of a beating heart right now of the Chicago Council, but that we really do invest in understanding how the world sees us. And so to your comment, you sort of listed, I think it was 4 places, if I was counting right, that have invested in trying to understand the Chinese public and how they... Only 4 places. I mean, you said it's a lot. Only 4 places. Think about how many places around the world, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States, regularly poll Americans to see what their attitudes are. Frequently, regularly, all the time. And we are one of 4 places in the world, only 4 places in the world that have released major findings on what the Chinese public think about Americans, about Russia, about Indians, about global engagement, about economic engagement. This is why I didn't sleep well last night, because I sort of went, oh my God, I've been hearing about this since I arrived, but it really is exceptional. We have a couple of minutes before we're going to open it up to the audience, including online. But maybe I could get just a few more thoughts from you. I can kind of direct you, but if you have directions that you would like to take it, I'm curious on the economic engagement question, because a lot of where the rubber is hitting the road on America's foreign policy is really about economic policy. It's about tariffs. It's about trade barriers. It's about export controls. How did you read, can you kind of flesh out more, and I'll start with you, how you read the survey data on Chinese public attitudes when it comes to economic questions in light of, your broader understanding of where we are?
One of the charges against Chinese leadership is China wants to establish an alternative global order. But if you look at the result of the survey, the majority of the Chinese people like globalization. They think their life has been improved by globalization. I think this is where the leadership and the people think alike. Is Chinese leaders also think globalization, China has benefited from that a whole lot. So there is no way as was charged, that China is guilty of trying to construct a new global order, because this is the very order that China has enabled China to become prosper. I think the second issue I want to call attention to is, so there is a gap between what the Chinese leadership is saying and where the Chinese people are pushing for. The Chinese people maybe are pushing for edging the U.S. out of West Pacific and East Asia, but the Chinese leaders' rhetoric is the Pacific is large enough for both countries to peacefully coexist and respect each other and win-win cooperation. This is where the leaders want the framework, the discourse to be. But the Chinese people and many talking heads in China talks about edging the U.S. out of there. So here is, I know where the Chinese leadership sometimes want to rein in the public opinion. They certainly want their people to feel confident, but they don't want their people to feel so confident that they, the message is U.S. should not be here. U.S. should return home, in Chinese, 滚回老家去. Asia belongs to the Asians. That's not where the Chinese leadership is going. So this is where leadership, vision, and the populist push, maybe there's a gap over here.
Fascinating. Dina?
Yeah, just a quick point on that is that, and in fact, there have been several instances, it was especially with border disputes over several decades, that the Chinese government has pushed some media campaigns to either sometimes mobilize public opinion, but often to pacify public opinion too, when the public becomes too hostile or too militarist, basically. And then going back to the economic question, so what pulled through the data for me, a thread, was that a lot of, and I think I may have said this, and Paul may have said this too, that underlying all this optimism is a sense of economic health. And that's why they're worried about U.S. trade, and why that's one of the top threats is U.S. trade restrictions on China. But it could be also a moderating force, because if China were to get militarily involved in a border dispute or on Taiwan, let's say, that would really hurt them economically in terms of, because their goal is expand supply chains, increase markets, grow the middle class, which is what the public wants too. And so if they were to engage in some kind of military conflict, then that would really hurt. They might get sanctions from Western countries that could trigger inflation, that could hurt people's living standards. It would also probably push their neighbors to increase their security measures so that they would also have a security guarantee of their own, or at least want to pull away from China, because it would increase distrust. So I think the economic rise and the fact that the economic factor is so strong in terms of optimism and confidence, I think that is a really interesting finding in the data.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important part. I mean, I think the 2 points on the economic side. One, on their assessment of China's economic prosperity and trajectory. I mean, I defer to I was struck at how optimistic they are, but I'll have to defer to economists, as to which I'm not, as to how warranted they are in that assessment. But I think the more interesting one is the point you emphasized, Dina, this the leverage issue. Because I think the polling results really showed me their awareness of particularly with regard to the economic relationship internationally and with the United States in particular. It certainly showed their awareness of the interdependence there. And it also highlighted their evolving assessment of their relative leverage within that interdependence. Because economic interdependence, I think the Chinese recognize, as we should, it's a vulnerability, but it's simultaneously a source of leverage. And the Chinese, I think, they clearly see economic benefits to the relationship with the United States, but there's also risks and dangers there. And I think this gets back again to the point of their assessment of the relative balance of power, because I think this is a central part of their calculation, and ours now, frankly, The Chinese are on a trajectory to believe that they have, if not the balance of economic leverage in the U.S.-China economic relationship, at least enough leverage to resist economic pressure from us. And they think that that gives them a deterrent power in terms of constraining U.S. pressure on China. And in fact, even in military scenarios, the Chinese want us to believe that a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan will be at least as costly economically to them as it is to us. And they've also said we're more prepared to weather economic cost than the United States is. I mean, that's a highly debatable point. But I think that whole perception and their calculation of relative economic leverage is a central part of how they perceive their approach to the United States. And that came out, I think, in the polling results here.
Absolutely. Please, and then Yawei.
I think that's what gives legitimacy to the government, right? They don't have procedural legitimacy in terms of including citizens in decision-making or even voting, but the fact that they've been able to increase people's standards of living is really strong as a legitimating factor.
I think one very important finding by this survey is in the past, China's biggest fear of the U.S. is U.S. using democracy and human rights, to launch color revolution in China to destabilize the regime. Right now, the biggest fear of the Chinese people, particularly in the wake of the elimination of USAID, is the weaponization of trade and investment to beat down China. That has become the biggest fear. And when the survey asked where U.S. and China can cooperate, 59% say economic and trade. Mm-hmm. So that highlights the centrality. So really, I think what we can take away from the survey is U.S. and China should have an economic ceasefire.
Well, it's a high bar, but actually, to be fair, it's been one might argue smoother than many people anticipated it would be between the United States and China over the last 6 months, in part because China has leverage. Dina, and then we're going to open it up. So if you have questions, please do ask.
Just a very quick preview of results that haven't yet come out. Our 2025 annual survey is that actually Americans are now much more moderate in their views toward China than they were even a year ago, partially because of what the administration has been saying and doing. So that's sort of a nice balance to the current situation. So stay tuned for that.
So while I turn to the audience, I'm going to ask one immediately online, and it's because it was one we were going to get to and haven't yet. What are the challenges of conducting a survey like this in China? Dina, let's have you start with that.
Okay, all right, I'll start. Well, it used to not be such a challenge. About 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, there were a lot more surveys done in China. But it's a much more closed system now, and it's much harder to be able to do surveys in a very representative, rigorous, statistical way. So we were really lucky to work with the Carter Center and with NORC to be able to work through a Singaporean call center to do a very rigorous, stratified sample that covers nationwide of the entire population in a statistically solid way that is up to the standards of U.S. polling. So that's really been the major point. It's a closed media environment. There's the possibility of self-censorship. The Chinese government is very wary of other countries doing polls there unless they're okay with some market research. So this is why it's been it's so rare to get this kind of solid public opinion data that we can really trust and look at the different pockets of here's what the generational views, how they differ, here's how educational views differ. So that's one of the main reasons why it's been so difficult. Yawei, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think you probably know this. This survey is on China's outlook of foreign policy. So there's no domestic part because you just won't be able to ask those questions, or whoever you want them to conduct a survey will turn to you saying, we're not going to ask those questions. Here in the U.S., the survey, the questionnaire has to be approved by the universities, and the universities now are becoming very, very sensitive to the safety of the people that you're going to poll. They want to make sure that you do not cause any potential harm to the people that you're going to question, because you don't know if they're monitored. And that also goes to what Dina talked about, self-censorship. So that's why I think the questionable answers to the Russia-North Korea question is, maybe when they answer the question, they think Big Brother is watching. Maybe I'll come up with an answer that they think the government prefer to hear. We don't know. These are educated guesses, and these are challenges. And China has a much restrictive regulation on data crossing the border. So that's another challenge.
Thank you. Okay, we'll come to the audience. Gentleman in the red shirt.
Thank you. I'm Eric Mao. I run the Geopolitical Forum. My question is, Yawei, you mentioned China's economy is going nowhere. And on the other hand, the survey shows the optimism. So especially when it comes to economy, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how, Yawei, how do you square these two, if you can?
Again, I think on the answer to that question, actually, if you look deeper into the survey, you see the Chinese actually have very correctly identified all the problems, the youth unemployment, all the others. They know where the problems are, and but they still say they're confident about the future of China's economic growth. So here, I guess that we do need to be more sensitive to the issue, whether they have honestly and accurately answer that question. And of course, we can also, to a certain extent, blame the China's media environment. Is that economic woes are not supposed to be discussed. A few scholars who have publicly discussed that, something bad happened to them. So maybe the lack of information, they don't see the whole picture. So there are a variety of reasons. We just need to be careful when we try to draw conclusions.
And there are some really interesting differences when you look at education. So education is also one of these big dividing lines, especially on economic attitudes. And the younger people who tend to be better educated are a little bit less optimistic than those who are not college educated, because there are not enough jobs for the highly educated people in the labor market right now. So that seems to have come out a little bit in the data analysis.
One can't help but wonder also whether, and again, these are hypotheses, but whether it's a reading or it indicates a level of confidence or trust in leadership, right? Sometimes you might know the problems, but your assessment of the direction of travel has a lot to do with whether you think you've got a good leader or whether you think that things are not kind of moving along a path that inspires confidence. Gentleman here, and then we'll go further back.
Thank you, Madam President, and welcome to the Chicago Council of Global Affairs.
Thank you.
You mentioned export controls. This is a very interesting issue. On the one hand, you see people like Jensen Huang, Bill Gates. I just read an article in the Harvard Business Review about that export controls are incentivizing China to develop advanced semiconductor chips, whereas the previous administrations under Gina Raimondo as the Secretary of Commerce said that the Chinese will not go ahead of the U.S. in AI on her watch. Now, how do you think the export controls are working? Are they having a effect of creating an incentive for the Chinese, as evidenced by companies like Huawei in developing their chips? Thank you very much.
Great question. And we're going to take a second one right here in the second row. I think you had your hand up, didn't you? No? Okay. Gentleman behind you. Sorry. Take two at a time, maybe.
It's the American economic troubles creating a situation that makes the Chinese people feel more optimistic.
Thank you. Comment. That was a good comment. I appreciate it. Which isn't to say I agree or disagree. And then you can choose, since you can see what's going on there, Ariel. Somebody in the back.
Hello, I'm Jake Warner. I study U.S.-China relations at the Quincy Institute. Thanks to my friends on the panel here. One of the sort of fears in D.C. is that as the Trump administration destroys, for example, the humanitarian aid system of the United States, that China will step into that role and sort of seize the power that the United States derived from that. When I talk to Chinese officials and researchers, they generally are very skeptical of that as a possibility. And in part, that's because China has other priorities. But in part, it's because the Chinese government fears a kind of narrow nationalism within the Chinese people. And this is something that I think we're quite familiar with now. Basically, the idea that why are you helping those foreigners over there? You should be helping our people at home. I'm wondering if the survey results throw into question that kind of like stereotype about the Chinese people, that the Chinese leaders really do have to be quite careful about this sort of inward-focused nationalism, and if there is more space for Chinese leaders to do more abroad around humanitarian issues, around the climate crisis, around development, these sorts of things.
Great question. And from the Quincy Institute. Are you based in Chicago? I am. Fabulous. Come to our events.
Quincy Institute, Jake Warner.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So feel free to speak beyond the data, since we understand that the data don't necessarily answer the questions that were asked, but they were excellent questions. Who would like to go first?
Well, there's kind of a common theme among all three of the questions or the comments here. I mean, I'm not on the export control question. I'm not an economist, so I can't really speak with any authority on how well they've been working. But I think there is an incentive there. It gets back to the point that we talked about earlier, the Chinese assessment of its relative leverage. I mean, they certainly perceive, and in fact, a lot of the proponents of the export controls in the United States characterize them as part of the de-risking or decoupling strategy. And the Chinese response to that as well, the two can play at that game. If you're going to try to limit our access to international technologies or try to weaken our economy, and they do believe that that's part of the conspiracy theory, they're going to try to maximize their response to that and their leverage. And I think, experts will tell you that that's playing out in all kinds of different sectors, because the Chinese certainly perceive, I think more than any other factor, the science and technological competition between the United States and China is really the central element of the composition at this point. And I think it is providing the Chinese incentives to minimize their dependence on us, and in fact, through their engagement with the rest of the world, to try to maximize the dependence of other countries on China. From the Chinese perspective, if the United States is going to force countries in the world to choose, we're going to give other countries the incentive to choose us and to limit our dependence, as I said. And I think that addresses the comment that was made that their perception of U.S. economic strategies and economic growth rates are arguably one of the sources of their confidence. On Jake's question, I guess that's not necessarily an economic theme, but I think that we talked about the fact that, I agree with the point that there's too much of a rush to conclusion that the Chinese are going to jump in to try to fill every vacuum that the United States is vacating now through a variety of strategies and policies that have been promulgated by the Trump administration. But I think, I agree, I think, Jake, with your point that the Chinese are not quite as enthusiastic and eager to fill all of those gaps. I mean, they do have other priorities, and they do have vulnerabilities that they want to avoid. I don't think they're trying to take over the world entirely at our expense. They'll score points against us, and they'll play a greater role in humanitarian and other issues to the extent that they perceive it as consistent with their own priorities and interests. But I think there's going to be a limit to that.
Yeah, I think most of the questions are not what we're trying to find from our survey, but you ask questions that are they're drivers of people who are surveyed. How they think about the U.S. export control, I think, is one of the drivers to enable the Chinese think U.S. is really out there to take China down. Yeah. And of course, this is also pushing more, enabling the Chinese people to become more nationalistic. You're going to block us, but we're going to get out of the block. We developed the bomb, of course, with no technology after the Russian technicians withdrew, we were able to do it, and chips and others. And yesterday, I guess it's a powerful message to say, look, our vast array of our weapons, a lot of them look at American arms, the helicopter, I think particularly look like Black Hawk. But again, in terms of Jake's question, I think that also makes people we survey become more proactive in supporting China to go more global. But China is less involved in providing humanitarian support, but more involved in infrastructure construction because that's over capacity. That's why Czechoslovakia and Serbia leaders are in China, because China has invested so much in these two countries.
Dina.
Just a final point just on this. We didn't ask about Jake, this is going to your question. We didn't ask about assistance ourselves in our polling, but Tsinghua, I'm sure I'm butchering that name, university did ask about it in 6 in 10. Chinese say that their country is giving too much assistance to other countries. I will say they might not know the proportion of what is given as foreign assistance, however you want to define that, to their national economy, just like Americans are also always saying that the United States should cut back on assistance to other countries and foreign aid, but they don't have any idea of how infinitesimal that percentage was of our overall GDP.
I did overlook that part of Jake's question, and one thought that just occurred to me is that there was some concern along those lines that was raised after the Chinese launched the Belt and Road Initiative, that there was a lot of Chinese investment and attention being given to other developing countries at the expense of domestic priorities.
I'm going to take one last question, and it's going to come from one of our most favored and respected engagers at the council. I'll let you introduce yourself, but it's looking forward to the question.
Alex Cruzo of Telesto, also on the board of the council. Mm-hmm. What should U.S. policymakers do differently because of this data? And what do you think from a business lens? What are the biggest implications for U.S. business leaders?
And I just want to echo that one of the questions that came in online was exactly this. So thank you for articulating it as well. Who wants to take that? And as you do, if you'd like to use it as your sort of moment to conclude, which I hate to say, it's because we are at time. But let me come to you first. We'll work back this way.
What should the United States do in response to these results? Well, I guess I would say that we should start retreating from the idea that China is a monolith and that the Chinese people don't think for themselves and everything they believe is a product of propaganda. One of the other thoughts that occurred to me was that, in fact, Jake reminded me of it, that there is genuine Chinese nationalism. And the polling results, I think they frame it in part as the support for Xi's nationalist priorities. But my caveat on that is that this is not new or unique to Xi. These are nationalist objectives that have been genuine in China for 75 years, if not 175 years. I like to say that the Chinese Communist Party didn't invent Chinese nationalism. Chinese nationalism invented the Chinise Communist Party. It also invented the Nationalist Party that ended up controlling Taiwan. So I think that it would behoove U.S. policymakers to be attentive to the fact that there is genuine public opinion to which Chinese leaders, that reflects a nationalist set of ambitions to which Chinese leaders feel compelled to be responsive. They certainly manipulate it and propagandize it, but there's a historical basis for it that I think is often dismissed as propaganda entirely by folks in Washington.
So,
Dina.
sure, I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but what comes out from the data for me, from looking at the American data and ours, is that the Chinese people, like Americans, want to better their lives. So they're happy when they see improvements in their daily life. That's why they can see that U.S. tariff policy could impact their jobs, their means of supporting their family. It could have direct implications. And Americans are very also concerned about economics and want to always job security. American security jobs is always the top goal for Americans every time we poll them. And then the other point that there's a commonality of we should work with China, China should work with the United States when it's appropriate to collaborate and cooperate, and then compete when it's necessary. And they really do support a lot of, this isn't in our polling, other polling shows in terms of science and technology, climate change, even trade. They see really great opportunities for working together.
59%
Yeah.
on the trade issue.
Yeah. So I would focus on the positive given the current U.S. policies toward China.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Please.
so I think for American leaders, maybe one is China does not pose an existential threat to the U.S. The Chinese leaders do not want to do that. The Chinese people certainly want to have a much better relationship with the U.S. 70% of the people polled, they're neutral. They think Americans people are not bad and are good. Whereas at the same time, American leaders clearly said China poses an existential threat. And China not only has the intention, but has the resources to do so. So I think President Trump has already lowered that temperature. But of course, the next big thing is economic ceasefire, as I mentioned before, to the Chinese. Mm-hmm. This is the most important driver of their suspicion of the U.S., the ill intention of the U.S. And finally, this is what the survey has not done enough, is the Taiwan issue. That is a pillar issue of U.S.-China relationship. We all draw comfort that 90% of the Chinese people think the people in Taiwan are friendly, which says China, at least the public, doesn't want use force to take over Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And I think the American leadership should seize this and encourage the Chinese, both sides, to seek peaceful ways to reconcile with each other. Thank you.
I think the thing that I would add as we close is the thing that really stood out to me as we approach the 80th anniversary of the convening of the UN General Assembly of the UN, that the data show pretty strongly that the Chinese people wish to engage internationally, that they like the UN. We know from the Chinese leadership and that global governance statement that they want to be in the UN. The United States, certainly under Biden, and I'm sure under Trump, are aware that the Chinese have the capabilities to reshape and shape the international order. And what I take from it is there's a lot to play for Americans and for the United States by staying in the institutions, because if you vacate the space, it's not going to remain vacant, because there are people who want in, who are in, who have norms, rules, institutions, values that they, like any state, would like to embed in those institutions. And so maybe that was why I was awake last night, because you wrote such a tremendous, and colleagues here, set of briefs on the back of such good data that clarified for me as we approach UNGA that there's a huge amount at stake, and whether or not the United States plays ball or cedes the space to other states. And I know people have a range of views about, what the United States should do. But for me, that was the thing that really stood out. But mostly the thing that stood out was, wow, what extraordinary work by the Carter Center, by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, by Dina and Craig and Carl and Lemma and others. And thank you for sharing it with all of us and with the world. So please join me.